This woman saw the vampire. Not only was she not afraid, but she even took the initiative to let the vampire bite her. However, the vampire across from her seemed to have met its nemesis, and dared only to hide. In the end, it would rather fight her than drink the woman's blood. The woman's name was Vanessa. Not long ago, she was still a comatose body lying in bed. The reason she ended up like this was due to a catastrophe 3 years ago. 3 years ago, volcanoes around the world erupted simultaneously. Thick volcanic ash obscured the sky. To this day, it has still not completely dissipated. Shortly after that disaster, a group of infected individuals emerged in the city. Their behavior resembled that of zombies. They frantically bit the living around them. However, these infected individuals had clear logic, and their movements were not sluggish. In fact, one could say they were swift. Aside from biting humans and spreading infection, they were almost like enhanced versions of ordinary people. Furthermore, due to their self-healing abilities, common methods couldn't kill these infected individuals. They had to be hit precisely in the head. Otherwise, even emptying a magazine would be useless. And the first infected individual of this virus was Vanessa. But strangely, she entered a state of apparent death after being infected. As a result, Vanessa was stored as a research specimen in a hospital. Later, as the situation worsened, military personnel wanted to take Vanessa back to their base for research, but were refused by the attending physician, Nigs. Just when the soldier team was about to say something, the hospital building was attacked by an explosion. It turned out that because of the emergence of the infected, people had already fallen into panic. Now they were randomly killing on the streets. The entire world had descended into chaos, resembling a scene of impending doom. The number of injured in the hospital surged, and the military team, seeing this situation, naturally couldn't stand by. So the captain left Jack and 4 other soldiers to guard Vanessa here, while the rest went out to suppress the riots. Just as they left, many patients in the hospital also showed signs of infection. They launched attacks on those around them, resulting in utter chaos. As time passed, 3 years had passed since the riot. In the hospital, aside from Nigs and the 4 soldiers, there were no other living humans. Over the years, although they had been holed up here, they still received some news from the outside world. First, those infected individuals were called vampires, because they would bite and drain the blood of the living. Secondly, the entire world had fallen. There were very few humans left outside. All this bad news left everyone feeling desperate. Even worse, the supplies previously stored in the hospital had nearly run out after years of usage. If they didn't go out to find supplies soon, they would likely starve to death in less than a month. Jack threw a can down from upstairs. The noise it made didn't attract any vampires. This confirmed that the area was temporarily safe. Only then did Bud and the others downstairs venture out. However, the vampires had long seen through Jack's plan. As soon as they came out, the lurking vampires rushed out, seeing they were ambushed by the enemy. Bud and the others fought while retreating. Bullets that didn't hit the head couldn't kill the vampires at all. However, the impact could still slow down their movements. But there were just too many enemies, and a portion still reached their side. At this time, a soldier arrived outside the hospital. He had just intended to go in, when he was kept outside by Nigs. She was too scared, and to prevent them from coming in, Nigs even pushed the soldier away. But she was bitten by a vampire in the process. Soon after, Nigs would also turn into a vampire. She planned to cut off her arm to stop the spread of the virus. However, the infection rate of the vampire virus was far beyond Nigs's imagination. When she picked up the tool, the wound had already healed. This meant she had already been infected. Seeing this situation, Jack immediately wanted to shoot Nigs dead. After all, it would be dangerous for her to turn into a vampire here. But at Nigs's pleading, Jack's heart softened. He only locked her in a cage, and even regularly drew blood to feed her. However, what he didn't know was that this decision would nearly cost him his life later. Thus, nearly half a year passed. One day, there was a commotion outside the hospital gate. Jack discovered that several survivors were calling for help. Originally, he didn't plan to save these people, but Jack suddenly noticed that his comrade Bud was among them. Only then did he change his mind and let a few of them in. However, this group of people wasn't well behaved. Among them was a man named John. As soon as he came in, he wanted to go out again. His reason was to look for his lost wife. However, at this time, the outside was already surrounded by vampires. If he went out now, it would be tantamount to leading others to their deaths. Therefore, Jack refused him and knocked him out with the butt of his gun. After Jack refused John, the other survivors didn't say much. However, when they went upstairs, they saw Nigs locked in the cage and began to discuss among themselves.
Been bit! She's a vampire.
Jack was furious upon seeing this scene. He sternly told them that this was his territory. If they were not satisfied, they could leave. The vampire and the comatose person inside were off limits to them. Under Jack's intimidation, the survivors dared not say much, but privately, they discussed Jack's brutality, especially the incident of knocking out John. On the other hand, Jack did not care about their opinions. He was just fulfilling his duties as a soldier. Jack was planning how to ensure that the food in the shelter could last longer. In addition, Jack also took the initiative to stand guard, so that the survivors could have a safe night. However, it was this unintentional act that led to the discovery that John was trying to open the door to leave again. Fortunately, Jack had set a code for the door. When John realized he couldn't sneak out, he actually attacked Jack directly. John attempted to force him to reveal the code. Faced with John's attack, Jack easily subdued him. At this point, Jack still never thought of killing John. However, John kept provoking him. After leaving, he gathered a few companions and planned to kill the vampire Nigs to vent their anger. Among them, 2 survivors, Ian and the mute, disagreed with their actions. They stepped forward to stop them, which prevented a disaster. That night, Jack kept watch just like the night before. After what happened last night, he was uneasy about these people. Just then, Jack noticed that Nigs in the cage was behaving strangely. He sensed something was wrong. Jack immediately got up to patrol. He discovered a vampire sneaking in, and Jack immediately opened fire. The gunfire woke the survivors, but it was already a bit late. More vampires came close to the survivors. One woman who had previously complained about Jack's brutality was immediately tackled and eaten by a vampire. The others were not faring well either, but thanks to Jack's warning, they were not completely caught off guard. After a fierce battle, the survivors managed to win with great difficulty. However, just then, Jack noticed a vampire had broken into the ward, and Vanessa was over there. He immediately realized something was wrong. Jack rushed over, but he saw that the comatose Vanessa had single-handedly taken down 3 vampires. Vanessa's strikes were swift and ruthless. She didn't seem like someone who hadn't moved for 3 years. As for why Vanessa woke up, it all began when the vampires broke into the ward. At that moment, they saw Vanessa lying there, and instinctively rushed to drink her blood. But the next moment, the vampires suddenly began to convulse, and whether it was due to the previous stimulation, the comatose Vanessa suddenly woke up, seeing the 2 remaining vampires. She didn't know where her fighting skills came from, but Vanessa easily killed the 2 vampires. Jack initially wanted to ask her, but Vanessa looked completely bewildered at this moment. Clearly, she likely knew nothing either. After simply dealing with the vampire bodies, Jack began to have a detailed conversation with Vanessa. When she learned that more than 3 years had passed, and that the outside world was now apocalyptic, Vanessa looked very worried. Only then did Jack learn that before she was attacked, Vanessa had a daughter still at home. Jack guessed that she was most likely dead, but Vanessa clearly didn't intend to accept this. Taking advantage of Jack's distraction, she stole his gun. Vanessa threatened Jack to let her go find her daughter. Fortunately, Bud appeared just in time, which stopped the farce. However, Jack didn't thank Bud for his actions, because he now suspected that Bud had betrayed them. After all, only he and Jack knew the door code. If it wasn't for Bud, how did the vampires get into the building? Hearing his comrade's suspicion, Bud felt extremely angry. He immediately got into a scuffle with Jack. Vanessa took the opportunity to escape, but she was unfamiliar with the layout of the hospital. Vanessa ended up on the rooftop. When she saw the devastated city, Vanessa felt very conflicted inside. Not long after, Bud caught up with her. He held a knife and took Vanessa hostage. Bud told Jack, who was chasing after them, to calm down. However, before Bud could say anything, Vanessa unexpectedly snatched the knife from his hand and stabbed it into his eye. Bud died just like that. Jack didn't have much thought about this. After all, traitors get what they deserve. But this calm was shattered the next moment, because they witnessed an incredible scene. Jack and the others understood very well that this was the ability of the vampires. Why could Vanessa also do such things? Perhaps she was a special kind of vampire. Jack felt a strange emotion rising within him. When the group returned to the building, they suddenly discovered a blood-soaked man crawling out of the trash pit. What surprised Jack even more was that this man was the vampire who had attacked Vanessa before. Why had he turned back into a human? This question lingered in Jack's mind. He arranged for the man to be cleaned up, and then Jack began to inquire about the reason. The man introduced himself as Light. He clearly remembered the things he experienced while being a vampire. Therefore, Light deduced that the reason he had become human again was likely related to having consumed Vanessa's blood. However, Vanessa was also uncertain about this. She was unsure about the abnormalities in herself. Thus, Vanessa couldn't answer whether she could transform vampires. Just as they were conversing, a commotion suddenly erupted outside the building. The group went up to the rooftop to check and found that another large group of vampires had gathered outside. But there was something different this time. These guys were surrounding a woman. John recognized her as his lost wife. The vampires tried to negotiate with Jack using the woman as leverage, hoping to exchange her for Vanessa. However, after learning about the abnormalities in Vanessa, his resolve to guard her became even stronger. Jack wouldn't be swayed by these irrelevant individuals. Seeing that they were trying to threaten him with a hostage, John actually believed them and wanted to hand Vanessa over to them. Jack immediately killed John's wife on the spot. With the hostage gone, the vampires' plan failed. But this move enraged John. He charged at Jack, wanting to fight him. John accidentally knocked over the wind turbine. Without this device, the hospital's power system would soon be paralyzed. The ultraviolet lights outside that kept the vampires at bay would also stop working. Everyone would die together. Faced with the threat to their lives, the others began to condemn John's actions. He put his selfish desires above everyone's safety. At this point, Jack had only one option left: to start the backup generator. But he needed to find compatible parts. According to his calculations, the batteries for those ultraviolet lights could last for 3 more hours. As long as they found the parts before then, there was still hope. So Jack armed himself and prepared to go out. Vanessa accompanied him. Of course, Jack wasn't at ease with John, so he had Ian and the mute keep an eye on him. Only then did Jack feel at ease to set off. The two of them exited the hospital building. Jack headed straight for a repair shop. There was a high probability that it had the parts he needed. However, when they arrived, they discovered an awkward problem. The parts were actually at the bottom of the sink. For the safety of everyone, Jack had to go in. He tied himself up with a rope.
If I tug on it, you take off. I don't want you messing with whatever's got a hold of me down there, okay?
After Jack finished speaking, he suddenly plunged into the sink. Vanessa was waiting on the shore. The first thing she encountered was a vampire. Vanessa grabbed the rope with one hand and shot at the vampires with the other, but it was basically ineffective against the vampires. Fortunately, at this moment, Jack had already obtained the parts. The two faced the approaching vampires together. Vanessa abandoned her gun and picked up an axe to hack at the vampires, but the vampire seized the opportunity and knocked Vanessa to the ground. Immediately after, the vampire pounced on her to drink her blood. The next moment, the vampire began to convulse as well. He had truly turned back into a human, but due to losing his healing ability, the bullets inside him killed him instantly. Jack, nearby, witnessed this miraculous scene. He became even more determined to protect Vanessa. If they could let the researchers at the base study the principle, perhaps they could prevent the apocalypse. Although Vanessa didn't know what Jack was thinking, she understood that her ability would attract the attention of many. She would likely be taken for research. Vanessa began to hesitate about returning to the shelter.
No matter what happens, I stick with you.
Vanessa was deeply touched by this. Only then did she make up her mind to return with him. However, due to the brief delay, the ultraviolet lights outside the hospital building went out right in front of them. The group of vampires surrounded the exit. If they were allowed to attack, the iron door wouldn't hold for long. Just as Jack and Vanessa were getting anxious, the hospital building unexpectedly opened its doors. Light walked out from within. Seeing their companion turned back into a human, the vampires were filled with shock, but it didn't change their thirst for blood. For this reason, Light directly sliced open his arm and offered his blood to his companions. However, for some unknown reason, the vampires actually turned and walked away upon seeing the blood. Jack and Vanessa, hidden in the shadows, although they didn't understand what was happening. But since the vampires had left, they could return to the shelter. With the arrival of the parts, the ultraviolet lights in the shelter lit up again. After everything that had happened, Jack confirmed that Vanessa's blood could turn vampires back into humans. At this moment, he remembered Nigs in the cage over there. Jack hoped that Vanessa could help. Vanessa didn't refuse. She vaguely sensed that Nigs was resisting getting close to her. Vanessa proactively extended her hand towards Nigs. Nigs didn't bite her at all and seemed to be annoyed by Vanessa. Nigs actually punched her, refusing to drink Vanessa's blood. Seeing this unusual action, Vanessa confirmed her suspicion. She decided to take the initiative. Vanessa bit down on Nigs. In front of everyone's astonished gaze, Nigs gradually transformed from a vampire back into a human. As a result, everyone knew now that Vanessa could turn vampires back into humans. Nigs looked around at everything, feeling particularly surreal. Nigs didn't expect to turn back into a human. After a quick wash, Nigs shared with everyone the information she had sensed during this time. Among them was a particularly noteworthy piece of information. Nigs felt that vampires were ranked by levels. She had previously been at the lowest level. In Nigs's mind, a voice had been trying to control her. Regarding this, Light could also verify this, and he shared more details. Some high-ranking vampires enjoyed the process of hunting humans. Hearing this news, everyone felt a heavy heart. However, bad news kept coming. That night, an emergency situation occurred in the shelter again. Light was just resting when he suddenly saw a woman appear not far away. He quickly got up to check and found that a woman was hanging dead over there. This situation quickly attracted the attention of others in the shelter. Nigs examined the body and discovered that this person had not committed suicide. She should have been strangled by someone first, and then hung here. The missing finger was evidence to support the suspicion of murder. For a moment, the shelter was filled with panic. In the already harsh conditions of the apocalypse, there was even a murderer among them. Jack realized that if they didn't catch the murderer soon, it would inevitably lead to greater trouble. However, before he could begin his investigation, an anomaly occurred again inside the shelter. Vanessa had actually escaped with Ian. Jack scolded himself for being negligent. He had failed to complete the task assigned by the leader. Jack immediately set out to protect Vanessa, but Nigs mocked him from the side, saying that Jack was too stubborn and cared about the orders of the dead. It would be better to protect more people here. Jack fell silent after hearing this. On the other side, the reason Vanessa and Ian left the shelter was to search for their loved ones. Vanessa always believed that her daughter was still alive. Ian was searching for his sister. The two first arrived at Vanessa's home. It was covered in a layer of dust, indicating that no one had lived there for a long time. After a simple search, she found no trace of her daughter. Vanessa gradually became desperate. Ian understood this feeling very well, so he stayed by Vanessa's side to comfort her. But at a certain moment, Vanessa accidentally discovered that a patch of dust on the ground was unusual. She hurried over to clear it away and found a footprint stained with blood. This was her daughter's footprint. The blood trail extended outside the house. This meant her daughter must have left the house. In this way, she still had a chance to see her daughter again. Thinking of this, Vanessa's heart was filled with hope. After a brief rest, they set off again to find their loved ones. However, they hadn't gone far when they encountered a group of vampires. But at this time, the vampires were hunting another target. Ian intended to pull Vanessa away, but she saw the survivors who persisted over there, especially a little girl among the crowd, who looked about the same age as Vanessa's daughter. Vanessa mistakenly thought it was her child. Ignoring Ian's warnings, Vanessa charged towards the vampires. With her shotgun in hand, she blew the head off one vampire. Another vampire saw that the situation was not good and hurriedly fled the scene. After dealing with these two vampires, the survivors approached to express their gratitude. It was only then that Vanessa realized the girl wasn't her daughter. But the poor appearance of the girl stirred Vanessa's sympathy, so she told everyone that they could seek help at the hospital shelter. Vanessa even told them the password for the shelter gate. Thus, a group of people said goodbye to Vanessa. But what she didn't know was that this action directly led to the collapse of the shelter. Vanessa learned from the survivors that all transportation was nearly paralyzed. Only a small portion of water transport was still operational. Wealthy elites from various countries had established shelters at sea. Perhaps Vanessa could find a ship at the port to go there and search for. But before Vanessa could learn more, she heard the distant sound of a vampire's roar. Clearly, the one that had escaped had called for reinforcements. Vanessa urged Ian and the others to leave quickly. She was responsible for covering the rear. If those vampires dared to bite her, she would turn them back into humans. Vanessa fired a couple of shots symbolically, and then allowed them to bite her. But the others clearly already knew her situation. They simply subdued Vanessa and took her to an unknown location. Meanwhile, the survivors, led by Ian, arrived at the hospital building with the door password. This group rushed in like bandits. Jack and the others heard the noise and came to check. Upon seeing so many people and Ian, Jack had a suspicion. His expression turned serious, but Jack suppressed his anger and asked about Vanessa's whereabouts. But Ian couldn't provide an answer. As Jack and Ian were conversing, the new survivors were acting like bandits. When they saw the stored food over there, they started to enjoy the food. Jack immediately stopped everyone and informed them that the shelter had limited food remaining. It needed to be rationed properly. The leader of the survivors, William, expressed understanding.
I promise. From now on, we get what you ration us, nothing more.
However, in reality, this guy was a hypocritical scoundrel, with a dozen newcomers flooding the shelter. Resources had to be redistributed. Water usage also needed to be controlled. For a period of time, everyone would be unable to bathe. The original residents of the shelter understood this, but Jack noticed that William often held various meetings and didn't know what they were discussing. This made Jack feel uneasy. Fortunately, among them, the mute could read lips, so he was asked to observe what William and the others were plotting. The mute used sign language to tell them that those guys were discussing the human resistance. They were planning to join that group. Jack had heard of this organization as well. It was a group formed by survivors from various places that united to form an armed faction. They helped each other fight against the vampires. However, Jack had always thought that they were just a bunch of scattered individuals. Although through the mute's description, William and the others didn't seem to be planning anything against the shelter, Jack still felt uneasy in his heart.
Okay, well, we got a new rule. There's no secrets in my house.
However, the next moment, Jack was exposed because Nigs in the infirmary suddenly discovered that the patient she had treated was dead. She was certain that she had previously stopped the bleeding. The first to arrive, Jack immediately noticed that the deceased was missing a finger. Clearly, the murderer had struck again. To avoid causing panic among the crowd, Jack quickly covered the body with a white cloth. Nigs explained to William and the others that their companion had died from excessive bleeding. However, upon seeing Jack's actions, John stepped forward to reveal the truth. He pulled back the cloth covering the body and discovered the mutilated hand. John guessed that Jack was trying to cover this up. He immediately exposed the situation about the perverted murderer in the shelter in front of William.
You kept that from us? A murderer.
After this incident, the trust between Jack and John shattered, and John, who caused this incident, joined William's side. This made Jack feel displeased. So later, during one of William's meetings, Jack took the initiative to walk over and try to sabotage it, but he fell right into the trap. A woman took the opportunity to steal his handgun. Meanwhile, William held a map of the hospital, clearly indicating that he had long planned a rebellion. At this moment, their strongest fighter Jack was subdued, and Ian and the others could only surrender. Thus, a group of 6 was locked in a cage. John saw Jack's predicament and smugly flaunted it in front of him. The next moment, he was also locked in the cage. After all, William didn't trust him either, especially since one among them was the perverted murderer. He had to be more cautious. At this time, the 7 people inside the cage were also suspicious of each other. Who among them was the murderer? Currently, the most suspicious one was Light. After all, he had once been a vampire. It was possible that he couldn't change his nature, although Jack didn't believe it. Seeing this situation, Ian thought of a solution. He actually admitted that he was the murderer, in order to unite Jack and the others. The reality turned out just as he expected. After someone proactively confessed, the others no longer pursued the matter. However, as a price, Ian was expelled from the shelter by William and others, left to fend for himself outside. Aside from that, everything else seemed unchanged. They were still trapped in the cage. William and the others frequently held meetings. Such unusual behavior made Jack feel uneasy. Until one day, when William and the others were meeting, the mute read their lips through a mirror. He used gestures to inform Jack and the others that those people were planning to eliminate them. Upon hearing this news, the few of them couldn't sit still. However, they haven't figured out how to deal with it yet. William suddenly came to the front of the cage. He took Jack away in front of everyone. In reality, William just wanted to ask Jack some questions. Not long ago, a girl named Lisa from William's group accidentally triggered a trap in the shelter. If she hadn't been lucky enough, she would have been sliced in half by a guillotine. However, William was filled with concern. They didn't know how many such traps were in the shelter, so he came to ask Jack about it. However, facing these opportunistic intruders, Jack wouldn't explain anything to them. William punched him twice on the spot. He planned to torment Jack later. However, before William could say anything, his girlfriend Catherine acted on her own, perhaps out of anger for her sister nearly being harmed. She intended to kill Jack. Catherine wielded a spear and recklessly attacked Jack and the others in the cage. In that small space, the 7 had nowhere to hide. Both Jack and Light were injured by her. If William hadn't discovered the situation in a timely manner and stopped Catherine, more people might have been injured. But this encounter made everyone more certain that those people wanted to eliminate them. They had to find a way to escape. And just then, a great opportunity presented itself to them, because Vanessa returned from outside. She brought back another injured woman. William and the others felt a bit awkward upon seeing Vanessa. After all, they were saved by her. Now they were the intruders, but it was what it was. And William and the others didn't explain anything. They simply let Nigs treat the wounds of the person Vanessa had brought back. Although the entire treatment process was being monitored by William's people nearby, Nigs still found a chance to tell Vanessa about the current situation. Upon hearing about the actions of William and the others, Vanessa was very angry. She went to confront them. At this point, William still wanted to appease Vanessa.
It's just temporary, believe me. Just until we know that we exiled them.
Although William spoke very nicely, Vanessa was no fool. She naturally wouldn't believe such words. However, at this moment, the others had the advantage in numbers, and Vanessa was alone. It was impossible for her to take down a dozen people, so she decided to endure for the time being. Vanessa planned to discuss with Jack and the others before making a decision, so Vanessa returned to the infirmary. While Nigs was treating, Vanessa took the opportunity to tell her about her plan. She asked Nigs to go back and inform Jack. Nigs returned to the cage and immediately informed Jack and the others about Vanessa's news. Regarding the content of the plan, Jack made some improvements to it, because after observing for some time, he discovered that the cage wasn't completely sealed. There was a ventilation opening at the top that could just fit one person. At that time, Jack and the others would exit through the vent and catch William and his group off guard. As night fell, Vanessa thought of the girl again. She didn't trust that the girl was involved, so she deceived the girl by saying she wanted to play a game of hide and seek. Seeing the girl leave, this was the best protection Vanessa could offer. Soon after, the operation began. Vanessa took the initiative to strike first. Taking advantage of the cooking opportunity, Vanessa knocked out the two guards watching her. Before they could react, gunfire erupted on the other side. Jack had already escaped from the cage. A man spotted him and opened fire on him. However, this guy wasn't professionally trained, and his shots caused no harm. Instead, Jack took him down with an elbow strike. He confiscated the man's weapon and immediately rushed into another room. Taking advantage of their unpreparedness, he caught them off guard. The people in the room were taken out by Jack on the spot. By the time William and the others reacted, Jack had already eliminated half of them. The remaining ones, although they could still resist, the outcome was already decided. Seeing this situation, William voluntarily surrendered. He handed over the key to the cage. Thus, William, who had been enjoying a feast outside just moments ago, now found himself locked in the cage. Looking at the remaining 4 people, Jack and others had disagreements.
We can't stay like this. In here, us and them.
Clearly, Jack wanted to eliminate a few of them. The others had varying reactions. John naturally voiced his objections. He criticized Jack's methods as too cruel and inhumane. In the name of moral superiority, Jack was very angry. His actions were all to save them, but he was seen as cruel and inhumane. The situation became increasingly tense. Jack, who had just killed in a frenzy, didn't mind adding one more head to the count. At this moment, someone stepped forward to ease the tension. They suggested a vote to decide. The final result was to exile William and the others. This made Jack somewhat displeased. Thus, William and the others were expelled from the shelter. Originally, Vanessa wanted to keep the girl, but the girl insisted on staying with her sister. She had to let the girl go. At this time, Jack and the others had time to understand Vanessa's experience from her recent outing and the identity of the new woman. After Vanessa was taken by a dozen vampires that day, she was taken to a vampire stronghold. There was a high-ranking vampire there who was not only more rational, but could also speak human language. He seemed to have known about Vanessa's abilities all along, so he was very cautious. He had his subordinate vampires try first, and that subordinate happened to be Vanessa's best friend, Susan, the woman she had brought back. At that time, after Susan had fed on blood, she began to transform into a human. The surrounding vampires were shocked by this situation. Vanessa seized this moment of distraction and pulled Susan with her into a tunnel. They ran for an unknown amount of time and finally broke through the vampires' encirclement. After hearing about Vanessa's perilous journey, everyone couldn't help but sigh. However, before they could learn more, they discovered that the shelter building was under attack. At some point, a group of vampires had gathered outside. They were well trained, and there were high-ranking vampires in command. The lower-level minions charged at the shelter recklessly. They endured the pain caused by the ultraviolet lights as they smashed it to pieces. Clearly, this batch of vampires was unusual. Soon after, the iron gate of the shelter was breached. The vampires were preparing to charge inside, but they were stopped by a sudden explosion. This was a trap set by Jack earlier. There were more traps in the shelter besides this one, but the vampires were not afraid of death. They charged forward, stepping over the bodies of their comrades. When they reached the elevator, they encountered a second wave of traps. First, Jack and the others unleashed a hail of bullets, but they weren't planning to rely solely on these bullets to kill many vampires. The main goal was to slow down the enemy's advance. Once more vampires had gathered, Jack immediately ordered a retreat. With the obstacles cleared, the vampires charged forward, and this was exactly what Jack wanted. The next second, a multitude of furniture fell from above the elevator, covering the entire elevator area, and crushing many vampires to death. After experiencing this painful loss, the high-ranking vampire began to weigh the pros and cons. It was clear that he was considering giving up. However, before they could relax, a large number of vampires appeared on the other side of the street, and they were dressed in uniform attire. They looked disciplined and organized. Unlike the scattered rabble from before, Light's face filled with panic at the sight of this group, because he had heard of their reputation. Even the vampires below looked grave.
Dimitri's death squad.
Outnumber us.
According to Light, there were faction divisions among the high-ranking vampires, and they would also fight among themselves. The two groups of vampires downstairs belonged to different factions. When they encountered each other, friction was inevitable. Perhaps during their conflict, they could benefit from it. However, that death squad was heading straight for the hospital building. Now, the only remaining trap was the ultraviolet corridor. Jack and the others stood ready here, preparing to use this final mechanism to deal a fatal blow to the vampires. But only a man in black walked in, and he showed no fear of the ultraviolet lights. As everyone puzzled over this, he destroyed all the lights. At this moment, Vanessa recognized him. He was the vampire who had attacked her years ago. He should have transformed into a human, but it was clear that he was still working for the vampires. Now that they had lost their last support, Jack immediately led everyone to evacuate. If they hesitated any longer, they would only be surrounded by vampires. Under Jack's leadership, they arrived at a basement. Everyone's gaze instantly focused on a vehicle. This was the emergency plan Jack had prepared before they arrived. An armored ambulance. They climbed into the doomsday vehicle, and they rushed out of the hospital building. Meanwhile, the vampires inside were constantly searching for Jack's whereabouts, which triggered the destruction traps they had set. The entire hospital building collapsed in the explosion. After Jack and his group left the hospital, a few days later, they left the city and arrived at an unknown town. The group prepared to restock supplies from a roadside convenience store, but it was quite embarrassing that this place had long been cleared out. There wasn't even a drop of water. If they couldn't find supplies soon, they would quickly die of thirst. So Jack suggested going to the military base, which had once been his station location. There was a high probability they could get help there. In addition, the military base had many bunkers, most of which had independent food supplies. Perhaps they could find some provisions. Although the group was reluctant to go, so far, they had no other reliable locations. They had to check out the military base first. Just then, they suddenly heard bells ringing in the distance. There was likely someone over there. However, the group was worried that it might be a trap set by the vampires, so they chose not to investigate. Shortly after, the group arrived at the outskirts of the military base. Upon seeing the scene, they felt a sense of despair. It was clear that there was no management here. Evidently, the military base had no one left, and because the vehicles blocked the road, they could only get out and walk forward. Fortunately, there was barbed wire around to serve as a barrier against the vampires. Beyond the barbed wire, there was a minefield. A vampire had once discovered them, but before he could take a few steps, he was killed instantly by a landmine. But this only deepened the group's despair. Such strong defenses couldn't hold back the vampires. As the group delved deeper into the military base, they found it to be very desolate. Clearly, no one had lived here for a long time. Supplies had long been removed. The hopes of the group plummeted, but since they were already there, they couldn't just leave easily. Therefore, the group split into 3 teams to search for any other useful items in the military base. Among them, John and Susan's group discovered a human man while passing through the office area. They quickly subdued him and brought him back to Jack for interrogation. Only then did they learn that the man's name was Jones. He was a member of the human resistance. Previously, his group had encountered a large number of vampires in the military base. They engaged in fierce combat, and during the chaos, Jones had accidentally gotten separated from his team. He had just woken up when he was captured by Susan and the others. After hearing this, Jack pondered thoughtfully. Although he didn't like the human resistance, they were indeed resisting the vampires. He needed to carefully consider how to deal with Jones, and according to what he said, a few days ago, they encountered a large number of vampires at the military base. This meant that it was unsafe here, and they had to find a new refuge. Otherwise, encountering a swarm of vampires would only lead to death. After thinking it over, Jack thought of a place. It was a secret bunker within the military base. He had executed supply transport missions there many times before, so he knew the exact location of the bunker. Not only could it provide protection, but there might also be plenty of supplies to sustain them for a few more days. Since Jones was also a fighter against the vampires, they could travel together. Thus, Jones temporarily joined Jack and the others, and they headed for the bunker together. When Jack arrived at the target location, he saw the locked door. Jack felt both happy and helpless. The lock meant that the inside was still intact, but they had no means to unlock it. After some attempts, Noel decided to use rough methods. Only then were they able to successfully enter the bunker. However, the explosion had caused structural collapse, and as soon as Jack and the others got inside, the entrance behind them was buried. If they hadn't closed the door in time, the collapsed soil would flood into the bunker. However, this also meant that the door outside was blocked by dirt, and they could only look for another exit. The only consolation for the group was the abundance of supplies inside. Not only were there various nutritional supplements, but also plenty of alcoholic beverages. A rough estimate suggested they could last over 6 months. The group couldn't help but relax. Only Jack remained vigilant. He took a quick look around the bunker, and confirmed that there were no vampires inside. He then felt more at ease. During this time, Jack spotted an isolation door. It seemed to be an elevator, but the elevator cabin was broken. Although Jack didn't know the purpose of this bunker, he could roughly guess that it might be some kind of secret laboratory, but that didn't matter now. To celebrate this hard-won peace, the group took out a lot of alcoholic drinks and held a celebration. They relieved their stress, and with the encouragement of alcohol, some people began to develop other thoughts. For example, John planned to take advantage of the moment to get intimate with the drunken Susan, although she clearly expressed her refusal. But under the stimulation of alcohol, John showed no intention of stopping. He even attempted to force her compliance. Susan's screams attracted the others. When Vanessa saw this guy bullying her best friend, she punched him to bring him back to his senses. But she was a bit too forceful, and John passed out immediately. When he woke up again, he found himself tied up. Seeing the strange looks from those around him, John wanted to feign that he was drunk and didn't remember anything. But what he didn't know was that the reason they tied him up was because Nigs had discovered the marks John left on Susan, which resembled those of a girl killed by a serial killer. As a result, they suspected John of being that perverted murderer. Just then, the mute pulled a finger out of John's backpack. Now that the evidence was conclusive, no matter how John explained, the group simply didn't believe him. They discussed in front of John how to deal with this murderer. The more John listened, the more frightened he became. He could only struggle desperately. After breaking free from the tape, John actually grabbed Susan as a hostage. Vanessa was worried he would harm Susan. Just like that, John fell to the ground in disbelief. But was he really that perverted murderer? Meanwhile, the previous person who admitted to being a murderer, Ian, was now wandering the apocalyptic wasteland alone. After being exiled by William and the others, Ian picked up a bicycle from the roadside and found some firearms along the way, which gave him a certain level of self-defense. Ian also arrived at that town, and he heard the church bells as well. However, he chose to investigate, but the journey was not smooth. Ian hadn't gone far when he saw 2 vampires. Fortunately, the 2 creatures were fixated on a corpse in a tree. They didn't notice Ian behind them. Seeing this situation, Ian immediately had an idea. He took out the machete he had found and prepared to sneak over to kill 2 monsters. However, before he could get close, one of the vampires spotted him. He had no choice but to rush in, and with one stroke, he killed one of them. After a brief struggle, the other vampire was also killed. By this time, night had fallen. If he traveled at night, the danger level would significantly increase, so Ian used the parachute hanging from a tree as a temporary resting point. The next day, when the sun rose, Ian set off again. He saw a white figure running by. Ian chased after him out of curiosity to check. He discovered it was a girl, and she was dressed very casually, showing no sense of the apocalypse. Perhaps through this girl, he could find a relatively safe refuge. But before Ian could say anything, he was discovered by the girl Emma. First, Emma saw that Ian didn't look threatening, and she even seemed a bit warm. Emma offered him a nut, which was a precious food source. Ian's face was filled with shock. After some conversation, Ian learned that Emma lived in a place called Eden. She had come out just to gather herbs and collect some fresh mushrooms as supplies for her community. Hearing the girl's words, Ian assumed those mushrooms were edible. and stuffed one into his mouth. Emma was shocked and quickly urged him to spit it out. Mushrooms were not poisonous when cooked, and eating them raw could cause various allergic reactions. Suddenly, Ian pulled her behind a tree. As two vampires approached, Ian was very tense, and he found it hard to protect Emma against the two monsters. But to his surprise, Emma didn't panic at all when she saw two vampires. She even made some bold moves. Although Ian didn't understand what was happening, he hurriedly chased after her. As for the two vampires, they showed no reaction at all to the two living people passing by. On Vanessa's side, they had already been in the bunker for several days. Recently, strange things had started happening. Originally, Jack had checked and found no traces of vampires in the bunker. However, a few days ago, a vampire appeared. After inspection, it was found that the vampire came out from the isolation zone behind the laboratory, but the space inside was very large, and they couldn't temporarily pinpoint the source. In addition, Nigs started losing her hair, which was clearly not normal. It wasn't until they accidentally detected that there was very strong radiation inside the bunker. This discovery frightened everyone. According to the current radiation levels, they would all die from radiation within a week. This made finding a new exit urgent. Thinking back on the previous appearance of the vampires, there might be a hidden passage in the laboratory area. After some effort, Jack found a hidden vent under a table. It was just big enough for one person to pass through, so they quickly packed their belongings, taking all the supplies with them before leaving through the duct. Susan was the first to crawl out. She briefly scanned the surrounding environment, and 5 or 6 vampires came into view. Susan opened fire on the vampires, warning the others to be on guard. However, after a long while, she still didn't see Jack, Jones, or Nigs. It turned out that not long ago, Jones had entered the isolation area alone to investigate. After Jack discovered the passage, he immediately arranged for everyone to evacuate. But Jones was unaware of this. Seeing this situation, Jack decided to enter the quarantine area and leave after finding Jones. For this, he even had Nigs waiting outside, ready to control the extraction. The original plan was very perfect, but Jack didn't know that Nigs had previously panicked and closed the door early in the hospital, which led to their comrades being surrounded by vampires. This had caused a tragedy. When Jack found Jones, he had already turned into a vampire. Jack could only escape alone, but the vampires behind him kept relentlessly pursuing him. When Jack reached the isolation door, Nigs saw the horde of vampires and felt a surge of fear again. Nigs completely ignored Jack inside and closed the isolation door directly. Just like that, Jack was caught by the vampires. He was devoured by the monsters. Jack glared at Nigs in anger, but it was too late. Nigs realized she had caused trouble again, and she hurriedly screamed as she fled the bunker. When everyone saw only her emerge, they immediately asked about Jack's whereabouts. Nigs ultimately lied that Jack had been torn to pieces by vampires. Even if Vanessa used her blood, it would be impossible to bring him back. The group believed her lie, and they realized they couldn't stay here any longer and had to leave quickly. Without Jack as their backbone, the group became confused about their next direction. At this moment, the church bells rang again. It was as if the gods were guiding them. They immediately decided to head towards the source of the bells, but they still had a long distance to travel. During this time, they encountered several vampires. Without Jack's protection, they were quickly overwhelmed by the vampires. However, at this moment, several arrows struck the vampires' vital points, killing them all swiftly. Before long, 2 hunters dressed as such approached. They claimed to be from a community called Eden, and they could provide temporary resting places for Vanessa and others. Thus, the group headed to Eden together. When they arrived at their destination, they were shocked by the sight of Eden. This seemed like a paradise without the threat of vampires. Through careful inquiry with the hunter named Simon, they learned that the leader of Eden, Micah, had reached a peace treaty with the local vampire leader, Elena. Every time the bells rang, the residents of Eden had to offer 2 jars of fresh blood to Elena. In exchange, the vampires wouldn't actively harass the residents of Eden, allowing them to live in such tranquility. Vanessa remained skeptical of Micah's account, as the terms seemed too lenient and almost completely unequal. Before long, strange occurrences in Eden made Vanessa alert again. Vanessa and others were temporarily residing in Eden at Micah's invitation, and as Vanessa interacted with the residents, she noticed that many women were pregnant. But strangely, there were no children at all in Eden. This was clearly unreasonable. Vanessa sensed that something was wrong with Eden. At this moment, a woman was giving birth. She was experiencing severe bleeding, and the people in Eden were unable to handle it. They could only invite the professional Dr. Nigs for help. However, she wasn't an obstetrician, and had no experience with such matters. Nigs still went to help, and after some effort, she successfully assisted the pregnant woman in giving birth. Both mother and child were safe. This was originally a joyful occasion, but Vanessa noticed that the woman's expression was somewhat wrong. Vanessa thought of something, and later, when she spoke with Micah, she asked about the whereabouts of the baby. At first, Micah didn't want to say much. However, he couldn't withstand Vanessa's persistent questioning. Micah eventually revealed a secret. All the pregnant women here are relatives of the human resistance.
We're doing our part to give the human race a future, to give them a new generation of freedom fighters.
Though it sounded very reasonable, upon closer inspection, there were flaws in this story. With so many pregnant women here, there wasn't a single child. How could the vampires not have noticed? After all, those creatures were just infected. After all, those guys were just infected, not turned into fools. Clearly, Micah wasn't telling Vanessa the truth. What exactly was he hiding? While Vanessa was pondering, she unexpectedly encountered Nigs. Nigs looked very sad. Vanessa had noticed for a long time that since leaving the bunker, Nigs had been distracted and absent-minded, but she hadn't had the chance to ask her about it. Now that they had met, Vanessa asked her the reason. Nigs hesitated for a long time, before finally revealing that in the bunker, she had given up on Jack out of fear. To prevent Vanessa from going back in, she had deliberately fabricated the story of Jack's death. Upon hearing this, Vanessa was furious. She scolded Nigs for her actions, especially considering that during her 6 months as a vampire, Jack had been giving her blood daily, and had been trying hard to find a way to turn her back into a human. Yet he was betrayed by Nigs. Now Jack was missing in the bunker, and Vanessa's disdain for Nigs was palpable. She told Nigs to leave the group, saying that she wasn't welcome treacherous people here. During Vanessa's conversation with Nigs, another former vampire member, Light, encountered a problem. He was invited by Micah to enter the church. Light thought it was just a simple prayer, but in reality, it was Micah's brainwashing targeted at him. Light, unaware of the trap, followed Micah's instructions, and as a result, he was successfully brainwashed. Now, his mind was filled with Micah's personal aura, and he recounted the backgrounds of their group. He mentioned Vanessa's abilities, which Micah seemed very concerned about. In addition, when he learned that Nigs had also been turned into a vampire, Micah similarly showed a similar concern. However, what Micah didn't know was that, while he was plotting against Vanessa and the others, they were also investigating him. After talking with Micah, Vanessa suspected that he was hiding something, so Vanessa found Simon, who had saved her before, and subtly gathered some information from him about things Micah hadn't mentioned, especially concerning the whereabouts of the babies. Micah only said the children would be sent to the resistance, but he didn't specify the exact location. However, Simon told Vanessa that the babies were being sent to the nearby fallen city, which had long been occupied by various vampires. Upon hearing this, Vanessa felt increasingly uneasy. A terrifying thought began to form in her mind. To confirm her suspicions, she and Simon quietly followed the vehicle. When the babies were being sent out of Eden, the vehicle suddenly stopped halfway, and the vampire leader Elena appeared in the distance. Obviously, vampires were not unaware. Vanessa assumed they were there to seize the babies, and she rushed in to help.
These were promised to me. Micah, our pact.
It turned out that handing over the babies from Eden to the vampires for their consumption was also part of the peace treaty. Upon learning this truth, Vanessa was filled with rage. Meanwhile, the mute, who stayed behind in Eden, had a chance encounter with Ian's clothing. The mute suspected that his friend might also be here, so he kept searching around. However, he stumbled upon shocking information. In one of the rooms, he accidentally found 2 photos, one of Micah, the leader of Eden, and the other of Elena, the vampire leader. It was obvious from the photos that they had a very close relationship, most likely as husband and wife. This revelation shocked the mute. If this was the case, then the peace treaty in Eden was undoubtedly a conspiracy between the two. He needed to find his friend Ian quickly, and help him escape from here. In his urgent search, the mute arrived at Ian's residence. The two were extremely excited to meet, but now was clearly not the time for reunions. Ian learned from the mute about Micah and Elena's relationship. He also knew that things were not going well. Just then, a resident from Eden approached, and the mute thought he was coming to deal with them. He immediately killed the man with a knife. Ian didn't say much upon seeing this, and quickly gathered his belongings to escape. They hadn't run far before being blocked by Micah and his men, indicating that they were preparing to attack. Micah gave Ian no chance to defend himself, and concluded that he had betrayed his promise, and killed someone preparing to escape. Micah prepared to have his men capture the two, but he didn't know that his secrets had already been exposed. Ian immediately revealed that Micah and Elena were husband and wife. Upon hearing this explosive news, the other residents of Eden became wary of Micah. Seeing that Ian knew his secret, Micah confessed that he and Elena were indeed married, but that was in the past. After she became a vampire, they had severed all ties. However, such a claim was hard for the crowd to accept. Yet, Micah remained calm. He quickly employed a second tactic, moral coercion. Micah urged everyone present to think about it. If it weren't for him, they would definitely still be being chased by vampires. How could they have such a peaceful life? In Micah's narrative, he became the savior of the people. Fortunately, at this moment, Vanessa and the others returned. Upon hearing Micah's remarks, Vanessa immediately exposed his scheme. She informed everyone about the events happening outside Eden, especially what Elena had said about the need to sacrifice the children. Simon could also testify to this. With these words, Micah's glorious image was shattered, and the situation began to spiral out of control. Micah suddenly hatched a plan. He betrayed Light, informing the residents of Eden that Light had once been a vampire. They definitely wouldn't be good people to be with such people. This statement had a clear effect. The residents indeed became wary of Light, but this was still not enough. Micah continued to emphasize his importance, pointing out that although the children had been sacrificed, it had indeed allowed them to survive. If he were to die here, then Elena would soon lead the vampires to slaughter the residents of Eden again. Under this threat, the residents clearly wavered. Vanessa realized that if this were true, they would certainly not leave Eden alive. Just as she was at a loss for what to do, an unexpected event occurred.
We'll go back.
Now that Micah is dead, the people of Eden have only one choice left: to confront the vampires head-on. Some of them were unwilling to return to their former days, so they left Eden. However, most residents, including Light, were not afraid to oppose the vampires. They chose to stay. But regardless of their decisions, it was none of Vanessa and the others' concern. They were merely passers-by here. Now it was time to part ways again. But this time, in their group, including the newly joined Ian, there were only 4 people left. Among the crowd bidding farewell, Nigs was nowhere to be seen. However, Vanessa didn't care where she had gone. After all, that person was disgusting. What she didn't know was that Nigs' disgusting actions goes far beyond that. After being expelled by Vanessa, Nigs actually sought refuge with Elena. She informed Elena about the upheaval in Eden, and then Nigs shared her experiences as a vampire. She praised the intoxicating feeling that came with it, boasting that vampires were the superior race. Nigs expressed her willingness to be loyal to Elena, only asking that Elena could make her a vampire once again. This flattery pleased Elena greatly. She bit into Nigs's neck, planning to turn her into a vampire. However, as soon as she drank Nigs's blood, Elena realized something was wrong. Immediately, Nigs also noticed that she had not been transformed into a vampire. If nothing had gone wrong, it should be Vanessa's purification that had rendered her immune to the vampire virus. Elena was disgusted by this human. If it weren't for the earlier flattery, she would have killed this woman on the spot. In the end, Elena just asked her to get out. Nigs was left stunned in place, and she truly had nowhere to go now. On the other side, after Vanessa and the others left Eden, they had no idea how long it had been before they finally arrived at a cabin farm. This was Susan's father's residence. According to her, he was a doomsday survivalist, always fantasizing about how to survive after the apocalypse. So this cabin was built according to his vision of the end of the world. Vanessa and the others could deeply relate to this. All sorts of self-sufficient equipment were available, and there was even a radio and various devices for contacting the outside world. Just then, the radio suddenly crackled to life. A man's voice from the resistance called out. He called on all survivors to unite and fight against vampires. However, the 4 of them began to fall apart because of this. It turned out that after Susan returned here, she didn't plan to venture out and rough it anymore. The supplies in the surrounding area were enough for her to live comfortably for the rest of her life. The other 3 didn't say anything on the surface, but someone was already harboring ulterior motives. As night fell, the group was getting ready to rest, when strange noises suddenly came from outside the cabin. They hurried out to check, and found that it was a vampire. Susan recognized it as her father. Upon realizing this relationship, Vanessa planned to use her blood to transform him back into a human. Before she could act, Susan had already shot him in the head. Clearly, the relationship between the father and daughter wasn't the usual kind of harmony. According to Susan, he was a piece of garbage, and he didn't deserve to be called a father. That shot was a form of release for him. That being said, they still buried the deceased respectfully. However, at this moment, Vanessa noticed that Susan was missing. The 3 of them immediately split up to search. After an unknown amount of time, the mute found Susan hiding in a corner of the forest. The mute speculated that she might be grieving over killing her father. Thus, he kept trying to comfort her with sign language. In reality, however, Susan was thinking far beyond that. Yet, she was still amused by the mute's antics. At this moment, the mute opened his arms, as if he was going to give Susan a hug. Susan, caught off guard, fell into his embrace. At this moment, the mute revealed his true nature. He kept squeezing hard, making it difficult for Susan to breathe. He even choked her by gripping her neck. And just like that, Susan suffocated to death. The mute skillfully took out scissors and cut off one of Susan's fingers. Clearly, he was the killer. However, the mute was unaware that he had already been exposed, because while searching for Susan, Ian had accidentally seen the mute's backpack, which contained many fingers inside. Clearly, these were the trophies from the mute's previous murders. Ian found it hard to believe that his close friend, whom he saw every day, could actually be a killer. Just as he didn't know what to do, the mute happened to return. Ian still wanted to act as if he knew nothing, and discussed future plans with Vanessa, but the mute had no intention of letting him go. At this moment, Vanessa happened to pass by, and Ian quickly informed her of what had just happened. Faced with this news, Vanessa found it hard to believe. However, the mute admitted everything. He used sign language to tell them that he had just killed Susan as well. This made Vanessa very sad. She picked up the shotgun, ready to kill the mute. To this, the mute showed little reaction. He just signed a lot to Ian. As for the specific content, Ian didn't reveal it. Vanessa didn't want to know more. She was ready to shoot him on the spot. But at this moment, the mute surprisingly spoke.
Tell her! Tell her the truth!
Vanessa was stunned on the spot, but before the mute could say more, Ian rushed up and beat him brutally, until the mute was left gasping for breath. But Vanessa thought this wasn't enough. She hated him for killing her best friend. However, after such a long battle together, they had developed a bond. In the end, he could be spared death but couldn't escape punishment. Thus, Vanessa left the mute to fend for himself in the forest. However, this decision led to even more disasters later on. Because of the blood sent on the mute, he was soon discovered by vampires. The mute initially resisted fiercely, but suddenly thought of a way to heal his leg. Thus, the mute became a vampire, and as a result, his leg was restored to its former state. Now, the mute was filled with resentment towards Vanessa. On the other side, Vanessa was unaware that the mute had transformed into a vampire to survive. She was discussing where to go next with Ian. Just then, the mute who turned into a vampire caught up with them. Seizing the moment while they were conversing, he launched a surprise attack on the two. Caught off guard, they were no match for the vampire, and soon they were all knocked to the ground. At this moment, Vanessa pulled out a flare gun, and while the mute was distracted talking to Ian, she precisely shot the vampire in the eyes. The flare blinded him, and if nothing unusual happened, the mute would starve to death. However, it was obvious that the mute's story wasn't over yet. He encountered a high-ranking vampire, who not only took him back to his lair, but also healed his eye injury. In exchange, the mute revealed information about Vanessa and the others. At this point, Vanessa was still unaware that a new enemy had her in their sights. They stumbled upon a slave car on their way inside. A vampire was supervising, and two humans with stun batons were capturing other survivors they encountered. They decided to intervene and save those humans. So while the vampire supervisor was distracted, Vanessa suddenly rushed from the side and bit him fiercely. Thanks to Vanessa's unique ability, the vampire instantly turned back into a human. The two members of the capture team wanted to help, but under Ian's gunpoint, they dared not move. By interrogating these two capture team members, Vanessa and Ian learned that there was a blood factory nearby, where a large number of captured humans draw blood every day to supply those high-level vampires. Vanessa and Ian immediately decided to go to the blood factory to save their companions. As for how to enter, they had a ready-made plan. They donned the capture team members' clothes and drove their truck, easily passing through the factory's checkpoint. After entering it, they began to act separately, hoping to find their lost family among the many humans. However, they were unaware of the layout inside. Vanessa unknowingly arrived at the blood extraction workshop, which looked like a meat processing plant, with body parts scattered everywhere. Just as Vanessa was about to leave, she suddenly heard footsteps approaching, with no hiding places around. Vanessa prepared to launch a surprise attack, while the opponent was unprepared. The two sides immediately engaged in a fierce battle. In the end, Vanessa was even more powerful. Using the tools around her, she killed the vampire on the spot. Afterward, Vanessa moved on to other rooms. One of them had many elderly people, seemingly a dormitory for the prisoners. An old man told Vanessa that the place where the children were held was on the other side. However, the guards were very strict, making it extremely dangerous. After hearing this, she immediately went back to gather Ian. They planned to search together, but were surrounded by a large group of vampires. It turned out that Ian had been bought off by them. At this moment, Vanessa still wanted to resist, but there were just too many of them. Plus, the leader, Dimitri, was there supervising. Vanessa was no match for them. In the end, she could only be captured. As for why Ian betrayed her, it was for the sake of his sister. Dimitri promised him that if he captured Vanessa, he would allow Ian to see his sister. As for whether he could take her away, it depended on whether he could persuade her. Now that Vanessa was captured, Dimitri kept his promise and let Ian see his sister. However, she was well fed and cared for here, and didn't have to run for her life. She had long grown accustomed to this kind of life. She didn't want to leave with Ian at all. Seeing this situation, Ian was heartbroken. He betrayed Vanessa to see his sister, but she was unwilling to leave with him. Meanwhile, Vanessa was already restrained, with her entire body restricted, especially to prevent her from biting anyone. Clearly, Dimitri knew about Vanessa's abilities. However, Dimitri knew much more than that. In fact, Vanessa came from the legendary vampire hunter Van Helsing clan, so her real name was Vanessa Helsing. Her mother was a pure-blood high-ranking vampire, but she died shortly after giving birth to her. Therefore, Vanessa wouldn't be infected or transformed, and her abilities were greatly enhanced after consuming blood. But according to common logic, vampires can't give birth, so Vanessa was considered an anomaly. Perhaps it was for this reason that she could transform vampires back into humans. Dimitri and his group sought to capture her, to uncover the secret of vampire pregnancies. However, he hadn't progressed much before an explosion interrupted everything. It turned out that the human resistance had long been targeting the blood factory, and they finally launched their attack. The scene was chaotic, and Vanessa planned to take the opportunity to escape. Dimitri wanted to subdue her as he had before, but after drinking blood, Vanessa's strength had increased. Dimitri was easily knocked down and fled. Then, other vampires came to stop her, but they were no match for Vanessa either. They were chased down instead, but at this moment, the vampires revealed their trump card. It was Vanessa's sister, Tina, but a vampire version of her. Vanessa didn't know how to respond, and at the distant bunker vent, Jack, who had been turned into a vampire, finally crawled out. What kind of story would he bring? The film ends here. This is the content of the first season of Vanessa Helsing. The film was released in 2016, and compared to traditional vampire portrayals, the characters in this show are quite subversive, more similar to zombies. The plot is at a passable level, and if you enjoy my channel, please click subscribe.